Today on American Nomad Traveler, we're exploring the birthplace of America, Independence Hall, where both Declaration of Independence and Constitution were written, debated, and signed in 1776 and 1787, respectively. Independence Hall is the centerpiece of Independence National Historical Park, which has been dubbed the most historic square mile in America. The park includes over 20 buildings and historical sites, all related to the founding of America, from the colonial era leading up to the American Revolution, key sites during the American Revolution and the cries for independence, to the founding of our nation as it is today with the Constitutional Convention in 1787 and the early years of American government. I bet you didn't know that Philadelphia was one of the first capitals of America in the 1790s. As Washington, D.C. was being built, Philadelphia served as the capital and was actually where George Washington served his 2 terms, most of his 2 terms. Some was in New York. Independence Hall is the centerpiece of Independence National Park, as I mentioned, and it originally was the State House of Pennsylvania, where the Pennsylvania state legislature would meet from the early years from 1732 up until the time of independence to discuss and vote on important legal issues. It was also the site of a courthouse where they'd try everything from capital offenses to civil cases to piracy, which you can see this courtroom and learn about the Supreme Courtroom when you tour Independence Hall. It's part of the tour with the park ranger. In the years leading up to the American Revolution, Britain had inflicted a series of stringent taxes on the colonies to pay for the cost of the French and Indian War. Now, this war was fought on American soil from 1756 to 1763. A lot of it had to do with issues with land rights over the Ohio River Valley and the frontier lands. The French actually had a lot of land in Canada. If you remember Quebec, they still speak French up there because of this ancient ancestry, right? Centuries ago, but it's still French speaking from that colonization to, the Great Lakes region and all of that. Well, this was fought between the French and their Indian allies, and also the British and their Indian allies, and of course American patriots who were British citizens. And this was their land, and they were fighting right alongside of the British. The French lost the war. Big win for the British. They ended up having to give up French Canada to the British, Montreal, which was a big seaport and part of the Great Lakes region, even east of the Mississippi River. West of the Mississippi River remained with France. And many American colonists fought, like I said, as British citizens for this. They gave their lives. Some of them were injured, wounded. It hurt the economy during that time. So they felt like, they really given their service, and they were proud to serve as British citizens. And some of these officers who served were George Washington. And believe it or not, many of the Continental Army members who helped win the American Revolution got their first experience fighting as British soldiers during this conflict. I only mention this because the British, though they were happy they won the war, realized they had been very costly for them, and they needed a way to pay back for the expenses of the war. They said, what about the colonials? They're not paying taxes. And the reason they weren't paying taxes is because the British citizens were not allowed to be taxed without representation in Parliament. That was the rule. They were British citizens, so they were not being taxed directly by Parliament. However, of course, they were paying taxes to their state legislatures, who then, of course, would somehow, in varying ways how their charters were set up, pay those taxes to Britain. And, of course, they would make tons of money from all of the, tobacco and goods and other things. They were getting tar, turpentine, all of these products for shipbuilding, all of this raw material. They were making their money from the colonists either way. This made the colonists very angry when they were not hearing their voice, when they complained about the Stamp Act of 1765, Townshend Act 1767, Tea Act 1773, and the Intolerable Acts, which were, as they sound, intolerable, closed the port of Boston, and led to a First Continental Congress in Philadelphia at Carpenter's Hall, which you can also visit at Independence National Historic Park. But we're talking today about the Second Continental Congress, primarily when after the they were trying to make peace with Britain, make it all work out, in spite of all these things, kind of peacefully protest, or sometimes there was some violent protest in terms of, you look more like violence, but throwing away the tea in the Boston Tea Party, that was seen as like an economic violence, right? You're losing millions of dollars in tea. But in 1775, the first shots of the American Revolution rang out in Lexington and Concord, and war had come. Still hoping to make peace, but war was there. So a Second Continental Congress convened at the State House of Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, where we are going today. This is now known as Independence Hall. And the Second Continental Congress primarily needed to discuss how to handle the war. They realized they need to have an army, because even though they were trying to get reconciliation at that point, they needed a plan. So a lot of things were up in the air that first year. And in fact, throughout that year, I really deep dive into this, and it's like an hour and 15 long podcast, but on all the reasons and issues that led up during this year and to actually declaring independence. But we'll keep it short here today. If you're interested, you can listen to longer podcasts as well. But they realized after they'd given an olive branch petition to King George, he was not budging. King George III, he was like, no, I'm not gonna, you guys are gonna have to pay these taxes. You're gonna have to listen to us. No negotiation. There wasn't going to be a peace. And people like Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin and others knew that. So Richard Henry Lee of Virginia on June the 7th, 1776, kind of brought this resolution before Continental Congress to declare independence, but it was decided they really needed to have a charter or some sort of declaration, a statement to say why they were declaring independence. Almost like a thesis of thought, like, this is my reasons for leaving you. And they came up with a committee which included like John Adams, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, Robert Livingston of New York, Benjamin Franklin, obviously, of Pennsylvania. But the one that they wanted to do it, to write it, was Thomas Jefferson, because he had an eloquence, this keen and astute ability to really take the gravity and the enormity of this liberty, this question of liberty, that this is a revolutionary idea, and do it in a way that was digestible, eloquent, beautiful, and really could not only speak to Britain, which you're declaring it to them, but also rile up and kind of rally the patriots and get people behind this idea of we are American, and we can be an independent nation. So they presented it on July the 2nd, 1776, his first draft, and it was approved. They said, we're going to declare independence. So technically, you could argue July 2nd should be Independence Day, but there are a few tweaks they needed to do in the way certain things are written. Didn't agree with some of his phrasing, stuff like that. So they changed it, had the formal, edited, approved version ratified, voted on July the 4th. Technically, some of the signatures didn't get on there until after it was printed by this fellow named Matlock and things like that. So, but that doesn't really matter for all sakes and purposes, intents and purposes today, right? July the 4th, we celebrate independence, and it happened right at Independence Hall. And you can stand in the very room where it happened, which is called Assembly Hall, which is in the center of Independence Hall. Now, fun fact, the first public reading of the Declaration of Independence took place on the lawn of Independence Hall on July the 8th, 1776. And guess how they got everybody to come and to know it was time to read this revolutionary and Declaration of Independence against this world superpower in the mother country? Yeah, they rang what we know now as the Liberty Bell. It didn't have a crack in it at that time, although it had some issues with cracking and throughout the years. We'll get to that on a future post. But so they rang the Liberty Bell. They didn't really call it the Liberty Bell back then, but it does have an description of liberty. Declare liberty throughout the land. It's from Leviticus. very prophetic in a way. I'm kind of a not, I don't believe in coincidences type person in this situation. I feel like it was, a little bit of a grace there, right? The eventually, FYI on the Liberty Bell, I'll just quickly say, when the British ended up taking over Philadelphia in 1777, they actually took the Liberty Bell as some patriots, not because they really saw the significance of the Liberty Bell, but they took it and they hid it in the countryside so it couldn't be melted down for British munitions. And you're like, well, wait, the British took over Philadelphia? Like, when did that happen? So Continental Congress actually continued to stay in Philadelphia until September 1777, when the Battle of Brandywine happened in the neighboring area. And General Lord Howe of the British Army, he beat George Washington. It was a very tight battle, and actually ended up strategically, we won't get into that, but kind of helped the Americans in the long term, even though they lost. But they did lose Philadelphia for about 9 months. And during that time, the Independence Hall was used as a prison for prisoners of war, also like a hospital for the prisoners of war. The Continental Congress fled to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which we learned about on AmericanNomadTraveler.com in a recent blog post, and then eventually settled in York, Pennsylvania, before they finally returned to the State House of Pennsylvania, Independence Hall, in 1778, and stayed there throughout the rest of the war. Now, at the end of the war in 1783, which was the formal end of the war with the Treaty of Paris, Philadelphia kind of continued business as usual, but this new government they had, the first government of the structure of the United States, known as the Articles of Confederation, was very ineffective, and they realized they needed to restructure the government. So in May 1787, delegates were called from different states to Philadelphia's Independence Hall for a constitutional convention. Now, I let you know that one state did not show up. It was Rhode Island. They were concerned that as a small state, their rights would be violated and they would not be respected at this convention, so they didn't show up. Which, quick tip, as I've said before, if you think your rights are being violated, you might want to show up and raise your hand and stand up for yourself. But Rhode Island made out fine. They took care of the small states. As we know, with having our Senate, every state has equal representation, of course. They originally wanted to simply tweak the Articles of Confederation, but they decided, no, they had to start from scratch. It was broken. And you asked why? Well, we'll detail all of that actually in my other longer post I did, podcast, but also when we go to the National Constitutional Center, where you really learn about all the issues with the Articles of Confederation. A couple things it did is states, federal government could not tax, only the states could, so they had to beg the states for money, and the states were not giving the federal government money. So a lot of bills were getting unpaid, including members of the Continental Army, which drove George Washington insane because he wanted his people paid. Also, there was no common currency. Every state had their own type of money, which was a nightmare, and especially for interstate commerce. So thankfully, at this Miracle of Philadelphia from May 1787 to September 1787, they had political geniuses present like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Roger Sherman, and others who helped to create a framework for government. And of course, Benjamin Franklin was there, for people, by the people, and for the people. It had checks and balances to help curtail the risk of tyranny, which is a word we'll use, as they had just tried to fight a war to get away from that, right? And it remains a living document today. We still use the Constitution, and for the most part, it works. It's not perfect, but it's a living document. It's agile enough to adjust to the times, but firm enough to prevent anyone from infringing on the rights of the people unless we let them. And that's where it comes in, that however, the Constitution is more than words on paper, dried ink, but as Madison and the other founders wanted and would call us to action, the key ingredient of the government is you and me. As citizens, it's our job to research issues, make our voices heard, and vote. And I will leave us with that today. Hope you like the snapshot tour of Independence Hall. I will say, actually, before we wrap up, plan your visit, super easy. You will need tickets in advance. You can get them the day of, but you'll run the risk that they might be sold out because there's so many school groups and individuals who are planning their trips to the birthplace of democracy for America. Go to the Independence Hall website. Just Google it. It'll come right up. And you'll be able to reserve your tickets online through recreation.gov. You can also find a lot of resources about this on AmericanNomadTraveler.com. I have a whole series on Philadelphia and some quick tips, including visit the Visitor Center, which is a great resource. It's right by Independence Hall. But thanks for tuning in. Check out the podcast, the longer version, if you really want to deep dive into the history and get some additional travel tips. And we'll see you next time.